Chapter 11. Immortality. Each soul slumbers a little while on the shadowy side of the stream, and waking remembers life with a smile as a tale once told in a dream. Spirit never dies. All too often those who search for the soul's immortality do so in answer to the question, will a man live again? And they cloud the issue, for if a man be immortal, he never dies, nor is he ever born. He simply is. That which has no ending can have no beginning, and that which has no beginning or ending is timeless and infinite, is pure being, exists forever. It is apparent that the body is not immortal. It has an obvious beginning and an obvious end. What we expect to be immortal in man is thus invisible, is spirit, a mysterious presence that animates body with consciousness. Each of us knows this presence very well, for it is what we feel ourselves to be. It is what we refer to when we say I. This I, then, this consciousness we know to be ourselves, is what we expect to be perpetuated after the death of the body. What and who is this I? Is it the accumulated memories of a lifetime? Is it the knowledge each of us has attained? Is it some central perception station at the nerve endings of the five senses? Perhaps it is all of these, but it is a certainty that it is consciousness, for only that which is conscious is capable of referring to itself as I. And consciousness is invisible. True, we mark consciousness in another being by observing that it is animated, but we never see this consciousness, never touch or hear it. It exists within the very depths of the creature, and we understand it at all only by understanding the consciousness in ourselves. There are not different kinds of consciousness. Consciousness is consciousness. The sense of self that peers from behind your eyes is the same sense of self that peek from behind the eyes of your neighbor. Though this awareness is never at the same identical stage of development in any two beings, the difference is always one of degree and never of kind. One self pervades the universe, and differentiating in an attempt to know itself better, it attains the finiteness and uniqueness by becoming multiplicity instead of unity. Each creature is thus an expression of the immortal self. There is that within it which was never born and which will never die. The false I. What is this deathless, ageless spirit that each of us senses within himself? How ephemeral it seems and how difficult to understand. Like mercury, it slithers from under our fingers the minute we try to grasp it. For a second, a moment, we have a flash of insight, so that we seem right on the verge of discovering some mighty secret. Then we begin to think about it, and it disappears, leaving us wondering if we haven't imagined it. Something blocks us away from the discovery. Some false habit of thought bars us from the true knowledge of self. The culprit is the ego, the erroneous sense of self which we accumulate during our lifetimes. The death of the ego, which we fear so much, is the very thing we must achieve before we take unto ourselves the consciousness of immortal self. Let us reconsider the timeless, spaceless qualities of universal subconscious mind, which has no beginning and no end, which is conscious but not self-conscious, and which is a mortal being. Self without beginning or end incarnates, and in so doing becomes something with a beginning. Anything with a beginning must have an end, and so the cycle of birth and death of physical bodies is established. With the birth of the physical body, there is gradually built up something subtle and deluding, the accumulated experience undergone by self within body, which gives rise to a sense of separateness and isolation, and is ego. This is memory of the beginning of physical experience, and we are deluded into calling it I. In this manner we fail to perceive our true being, identify ourselves with the shallow and transitory little ego, and are shut away from the infinite and immortal intelligence from which we have sprung. Nearly everyone considers his ego to be his true self, and as a result, is totally unable to comprehend a life after the death of the physical body. He remembers the birth of his ego in his first experiences and thoughts, and thus he senses the ego's inevitable end. Since he identifies himself with ego, he either looks forward with fear to undesirable oblivion or refuses to consider the matter of eventual death at all. If fear has been sufficiently ingrained in him by the practitioners of masochism, he even fancies himself faced by the possibility of providing an eternal roast for the fires of hell. Rebirth of consciousness. Ego, the tinsel trapping of self-awareness, is the undoing of us all. It bars us from consciousness of universal self. It perceives all things as existing outside of consciousness, and thus deludes us into believing that things originate on the physical plane. It loads us with a sense of personal responsibility, engenders bitterness and hate by its fancied wounds, sees itself as a speck in a limitless universe, and blows itself up all the bigger in a hopeless attempt to fill infinity. The question is not how the ego shall live, but how the ego shall die. For only when the ego dies do we truly begin to live. The ego is mortal. It has its beginning and it has its end. When death overtakes the body, it overtakes the ego also. Freed at last from delusion, self knows self and sees its immortality. The fear of death, then, springs from the ego's fear of dissolution, but only because we cling to the ego as our true selves. He who perceives at the center of consciousness the great self which is buried there, lets go of the ego forever and moves in tune with the infinite. The death of the physical body frees us all from the bonds of the ego, but the unshackling of these bonds during our lifetime brings power. The death of the ego, then, is not a thing to be avoided, but a thing to be welcomed, a spiritual awakening that illuminates all things, a transfiguration wherein the soul becomes fused with a mortal self. It is attained through humility, through love, through non-resistance, through fusion with the universal subconscious mind at the center of consciousness. Who achieves this consciousness perceives immortality. Walt Whitman said, "Afar down I see the huge first nothing. I know I was even there. I walked unseen and always, and slept through the lethargic mist, and took my time, and took no hurt from the fetid carbon. Long ago I was hugged close, long and long. Immense have been the preparations for me. Cycles ferried my cradle, rowing and rowing like cheerful boatmen. For room to me stars kept aside in their own rings. It avails not, time nor place, distances avails not. I am with young men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence. One mind, one spirit, one self pervades the universe, and its purpose is to know itself. It is primal stuff, first cause of all things, and is engaged in a work of expanding consciousness. Neither space nor time exist in it, for it is infinite, nor does it adhere to any form, for it is all form. It is becoming things, it becomes all things, and each form it creates is an expression of its knowledge of itself. It is eternal now, which is all times, past, present, and future. It is one place, which is all places and any place. It is invisible. It is spirit. It is intelligence. It is mind. It is God. Incarnating into form, it becomes that form, and when the form dissolves, the spirit again becomes universal. It is this in man, which is immortal, not the body, not the ego, not the personality, but the self. He who attains to awareness of the self in life attains to power. From the Upanishads, the one self within all beings becomes different, according to what it enters, and exists also without. Self is universal subconscious mind, which is infinite. All of it exists within each of us, and all of it exists without, for infinity is absolute unity, and cannot be divided. Therefore, if we would perceive our immortality, we must perceive the timeless being that exists at the center of our consciousness. But whether we attain to this illumination or not, we are immortal still. Everlasting life is not given to some and taken from others, for we are all one in reality. To him who is held firm in the bonds of ego, the veil will yet be lifted when the physical body dies and the ego ceases its delusion. Then he shall know as he is known, shall see self in self, shall perceive in an instant the vast reaches of infinity. But a degree of this power and perception can be ours in this life if we can only forsake the ego and take unto ourselves the mantle of God. Forsaking the ego. Ego proceeds from conscious mind, though they are not identical. Conscious mind is the reception station at the nerve endings of the five senses. It is a classifying, tabulating, analyzing machine governed solely by sensory stimuli and perceiving all things as existing outside it. It builds habit patterns of work and a mass of experience and perceives the movement of time. Thus, the ego is compounded of memory and prompts us to act always in the light of experience. According to the ego's conception, so our lives become. This thing we falsely call I, this ego, sees its limitations and brings those limitations into our lives. It fears and hates and envies, for it seeks constantly to puff itself up by vain posturing, by blind attitude, and it brings into our lives the physical results of these mental causes and keeps us constantly in chains. So it is that a man must first be meek and humble before he can enter the kingdom of heaven, before he can become fused with immortal self. Sometimes he comes to it through great suffering, sometimes through despair, sometimes through pain, but always the ego is reduced to nothingness before the portal swings open. And the ego does not surrender lightly. This posturing little elf, with its blind delusions, would have us believe it is our true self, and when we attempt to cast it aside, we feel its struggles in the very depths of our souls. So great is its resistance that men mortify the flesh, practice celibacy, abstain from all sensual pleasure in an attempt to ignore the evidence of the senses, so that the ego might leave and the center of consciousness be revealed. The ego is what we seem to be. The knowledge of what we truly are lies at the center of consciousness. Such knowledge is perceived only by him who strips the ego bare, casts it aside like a worn-out garment. There is a kind of death in this, because we are accustomed to regard the ego as our true self. But the ego shall die anyway, and he who achieves its death in life attains power. Seek the death of the ego and be born anew in the knowledge of self. It is the self that is immortal. It is the self, universal subconscious mind, which we truly are. All men have everlasting life, and it is not a question of whether we shall live again, but the insistent and glorious fact is that our real selves shall never die, just as they are never born. The spirit is birthless and deathless and changeless. The afterlife. What will the afterlife be like? It will be like stepping from the consciousness of a gnat into the consciousness of infinity. With the death of the physical body, we shrug off the bonds of conscious mind and ego, lay aside the limitations of flesh, and become one with the universal subconscious mind, pervading all times and places. We shall have no bodies in the hereafter, for we shall be all bodies. We shall be in no specific place in the hereafter, for we shall be in all places. We shall not meet old friends and loved ones in the hereafter, for we shall all be one, unified and indivisible, one self, one mind, one eternal I. The question is sometimes asked, what good is a hereafter like that? Unless a man have a body and five senses and things to accomplish and friends to meet with, what good is it? Wouldn't oblivion be better? And the only answer possible to this question is that oblivion is inevitable for the part of any man that asks this question, for it is the ego that poses it. It is conscious mind, built up of the experience of the five senses, that seeks to perpetuate itself, and it is no more than a flower, a bud on the everlasting shoot, flowering in season and withering out of season. Life with its give and take, serve and be sowed, strive and accomplish, cannot in any manner be compared with existence in the hereafter. Life is the ego's day in the sun. The hereafter is the eternity of the self. Moments of mystical experience. Space and time and body are the means by which universal subconscious mind seeks an ever greater self-awareness. From infinity, immortal self incarnates in space and time, and what it becomes is an expression of its knowledge of itself. As its idea of self enlarges, it withdraws from body and incarnates again in a higher expression. All evolution follows this path, constantly upward, always increasing in self-awareness. Everyone at some time in his life has come the startling magnitude of his own consciousness, perhaps. What miracle has caused me to exist at all? And at that moment, he stands very close to the veil, almost sees through it, but not quite. Almost understands what is beyond it, but not quite. He is startled and a little uncomfortable, seized by a strange sense of vertigo, wondering whether life itself is not the dream, a sleep he has fallen into at some dimly remembered place, from which he will awaken at any moment. But usually he shunts aside this rare moment of mystical experience and concerns himself again with the workaday material world, taking assurance from the solidity of physical objects and the sharp definition of sensory perception. Thus he lives like an ostrich, burying his head in the sands of life and refusing to examine the most miraculous thing of all, his own consciousness, where it has come from and where it is going. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. Shades of the prison house begin to close about the growing boy. William Wordsworth. Sprung from the everlasting self into life, there is in each child the remembrance of universal subconscious mind. But as his ego develops, as he attains memory of sensory experience and the conscious mind grows, the memory becomes dimmer and dimmer, until at last he can recall it no longer, blocked from its view by the posturing ego, which clutters the vision of the spirit. The animating presence. That which is, was never born, and shall never die, is the very being of each of us. One self, one mind, one life is in everyone. There is no difference between your neighbor and yourself, except that of ego, of conscious mind. The difference you perceive is the difference brought about through thought, for your neighbor is a product of every thought he has ever had, even as you are. Since it is impossible for two reactive beings ever to have the exact same kind and sequence of thought, there never has been, nor will there ever be, two identical humans, short of union with God. And union with God is achieved by all when the worn house of the body is laid aside at last. It may be achieved in life only when the individual ceases to think in response to the stimuli of the senses and originates thought at the center of consciousness. Then, free of the bondage of the flesh, he achieves power, control over all the circumstances of his life. Everyone knows that he exists, and not simply because he observes other individuals responding to him. That which he feels himself to be, he knows as consciousness, lying within his body, yet not his body. He observes other animated beings around him and correctly supposes them to be possessed of the same kind of consciousness as he, and he further observes death overtake the bodies of a few of these beings, and notes that the animating presence has departed. He does not see where the presence has gone and is mystified, for he does not know if it has simply left or has suddenly ceased to be. He further observes that this condition of death, or departure of the animating presence of the body, is inevitable to all forms of life, and thus is inevitable to him, and he vainly tries to peer beyond that event in order to determine if he might not still continue to exist after his body has ceased to function. Alas, the veil is too great for him, for he cannot imagine an existence without his body, and so, at last, he throws up his hands in despair and decides that his consciousness resulted from the fantastic army of circumstances that produced his particular body, and that on either side of birth and the grave there is nothing but oblivion. But no man completely accepts this delusion. No matter how vociferously he may proclaim it, no matter how valiantly he assumes to face this horrid assumption, there is something in him that knows differently. That something is self, the presence that animates his body. Birthless, deathless, and ageless, it knows its immortality. Self is not body. Your body is not you. If it were, and your leg were amputated, part of your consciousness would be lost with your leg. Neither are you simply brain. If you were only brain, then the rest of the physical body could be stripped away, and the brain would continue to live. Actually, the brain itself does not even think. Some invisible thinker merely uses the brain as a central reception station for sensory perception. Someone, something, is dwelling in your body, peering through the windows of your eyes, listening at the portals of your ears, using your brain to receive impressions. Invisible, hidden, gowned with your particular form, but an instant in the eternity of its being, it uses your body as an idea, then discards it and departs to whence it came. This is a mortal self. People want to know where they will go when they die, and the answer to that question is that they will go everywhere, for they don't truly go, they simply expand. Self freed from the limitations of body becomes universal self, the consciousness of all time, all space, all form. Since self is free of all limitation and multiplicity, it leaves behind personality and ego and conscious memory, which become immersed like the tiniest drop of water in an infinite sea. Ego goes, limitation goes, the inconceivably small I is replaced by the great I of infinity. A very intelligent but very egotistical man once said, "I cannot stand any conception of the afterlife in which I cease to be me and become somebody else, even if that somebody is much greater." And there are plenty of people whose idea of the hereafter hinges on there being plenty of social life, good food and good fellowship, lots of money and pleasure, and no pain. When it is pointed out to them that they will need to take their bodies along in order to enjoy these things, they nod with equanimity, apparently convinced that an exact replica of the one they leave behind will be furnished them in the hereafter. Behind every pair of eyes. It is always ego that blocks immortality from view, for ego cannot see beyond its own finiteness. It needs a body, needs separateness, for from these conditions it has sprung, and it projects a hereafter that revolves around bodies and personalities. Body and personality and conscious mind change throughout life. How shall they exist then in the hereafter of the ego? Will they be those which we possessed in the prime of life? Then what of the infant taken in death? What of the cripple and the chronically diseased? And how shall our characters and minds be in such a hereafter? As they were at the peak of life? But what of the feeble-minded and insane, and the murderer and the robber and the depraved? A strange hereafter of confusion and injustice, with individuals longing for better bodies. Such is the hereafter of the ego. But we needn't worry about it. It doesn't exist. Beyond the advent of death, body does not persist, nor personality, nor ego, nor conscious mind, for all these are the illusory trappings of finiteness, for which we have no further use when we return to the infinite. The great self enters into each body and becomes different according to what it enters, but upon leaving again becomes absolute infinity and unity. The infinite, says Emerson, lies stretched in smiling repose. And so does the immortal self, eternally one, the true being in every man, the observer who looks out upon the world through every pair of eyes. Reincarnation. One of the interesting theories held by those who demand a body as a prerequisite to any existence after death is that of reincarnation. Because conscious mind is a finite instrument and useless in dealing with infinity. Even great religious thinkers of the past have been led into the trap of believing in reincarnation, because they could not, with their conscious minds, conceive of any kind of existence at all without a body to accompany it. Only the Brahmins felt that true existence was unity with universal subconscious mind, but even they felt that a man must consciously come to this illumination, holding that he would go through successive reincarnations on earth until he attained it. No religious teaching has ever surpassed the enlightenment of the Hindus with their Vedas and Bhagavad Gitas and Upanishads, but even they could not forsake the illusory and transitory ego altogether, and thus were led into believing that individual men went through successive reincarnations before attaining the Brahma. It is a mortal self which is incarnating in search of self-knowledge, and only when knowledge of self is complete will reincarnation cease. The real you, the immortal self, will reincarnate to be sure, short of its attaining to complete self-knowledge. But the transitory you, the built-up thought habits and memories of the conscious mind, will incarnate no more, for it is only illusion, just a tiny instant in the eternity of evolution, whose very purpose is change. Ego will neither reincarnate nor persist after death. It is not the real you. It is scarcely even a microscopic part of the real you. Every incarnation is a reincarnation. Every child born is a reincarnation, for only one self enters into each body and looks out of all eyes and is conscious. Each of us is a reincarnation of every person who has preceded us, and the knowledge of all that has preceded us lies within us, in universal subconscious mind, which has been all things and all people and all events, and will be forevermore. Infinite Spirit. Is there spirit communication? Not in the way we are accustomed to think. Those who have departed are no longer contained by the limitations of personality and ego and conscious mind, but have become one with a mortal self. Yet the knowledge of all things lies in universal subconscious mind, and may be revealed to conscious mind when a contact between the two is made. So it is that the seance is often witness to unexplainable phenomena, for the subconscious always responds to the conscious, and nothing is impossible to it. Therefore, the conceptions we have of loved ones projected into the subconscious are capable of becoming manifest in the physical world. We see ghosts, faces, hear words, sometimes in the seance, sometimes without the seance, which bring the dead back with us for a moment. But this is always a physical projection of a conception held in mind, and is just as often recorded of the living as of the dead. There is only one contact we may make with the hereafter, and that is with the one immortal self which dwells there. It contains all knowledge, all love, all peace, and is the true being of everyone. There are not billions of personalities circulating through it willy-nilly. Such finiteness has been torn from it and left it pure and unadulterated and just one. Never the Spirit was born. The Spirit shall cease to be never. Never was time it was not. End and beginning are dream. Birthless and deathless and changeless remaineth the Spirit forever. Death hath not touched it, and all, dead though the house of it seems. Bhagavad Gita. No punishment in the hereafter. It is one of the strange facts of history that the words of the Bible have been misconstrued to saddle mankind with a vengeful God who vies with the devil for souls. Conceive, if you will, of a God who gives men sex organs that provide pleasurable sensation, then promises to burn everyone in hell who doesn't use them within a strictly prescribed manner. Conceive of a God who gives men eyes but still remains invisible to them, then threatens to burn everyone in hell who doesn't believe in him. Conceive of a God who made the devil and his fires because he knew in the first place that he would burn certain souls. A mighty, unsavory fellow, this God, this figment of the masochistic imagination. One cannot help but prefer his equally imaginative evil counterpart, the devil, who seems like a pretty jolly fellow after all, considering the very poor job he has been given. Immortality is not something to be won by good conduct, nor will good conduct send certain souls to heaven, nor bad conduct send others to hell. Only one self manifests throughout the universe, and it neither punishes itself nor rewards itself. It is eternal, and though it becomes a billion mortal things, its eternity is not touched. It passes into and out of myriad forms, but always remains one. Obviously, it neither sends itself to heaven nor sends itself to hell, for nothing exists outside itself. Have no fear of hell. There is no such thing. There is only heaven, consciousness of the immortal soul, which each of us shall eventually attain, whether it comes to us in life or not. Every soul is saved. Misapprehensions concerning sin and punishment and hell and the devil come from a lack of understanding of the message of God. The truth about each man lies in his spirit and not in the physical world. Sins refer to errors of thinking, buried guilt, and punishment is the inevitable physical manifestation of such negative thinking. By hell is meant the human bondage undergone by each person who simply reacts to the physical world and fails to perceive his inner consciousness, the kingdom of heaven. Awaken to your spiritual power. Turn your eyes from the physical world onto the consciousness that lies within, so that you may free yourself from lack and limitation and disease. We must come to realize that God is kind and just and loving and is in us, and there is no punishment in the hereafter, and every soul is saved. We need not fear God. We need only love him. We need not supplicate for forgiveness before an altar, for God's altar is our very selves. We are with him night and day. Religions and temples are built by man, but God's temple is man, and wherever we are always in a place of worship. We need only turn to the self that dwells within. The art of dying. Birth and death are the great transformations. The ego does not fear birth, for there is no ego at birth, but the ego indeed fears death. As long as we identify ourselves with the ego, the fear of death shall have its hold on us, and we shall regard it as a great calamity. But once we have freed ourselves of the ego and have perceived at the center of the consciousness the immortal self, death will become an adventure, for by it we shall be freed of illusion, return to absolute truth. Know as we are known. Become united with God. Life is the medium through which the great self seeks to work out its purpose, and each of us, a part of that purpose, has his appointed tasks and work. When these are fulfilled, it is time for us to return home once again, but not before. Though the hereafter may be a mightier existence than any known on earth, we nevertheless shall not return to it until we have worked through space and time in search of the knowledge that the great self is seeking through us. Our jobs are here in life, and we must do them before we depart. Many men poison their lives through fear of death. Since death is known to be inevitable for every man, it is indeed very strange that so little is known of the art of dying. For dying is an art, to be performed expertly or crudely according to our knowledge. To most men, death comes when the body has worn out and ceases to function, and is preceded by a period of time in which the body perceptibly begins to break down. As the hour of death approaches, the human soul has only two ways to turn: outward for the solaces of the physical world, or inward toward the universal self. A painful death, violent and full of suffering, awaits him who turns toward the outer world, for he is prompted by the ego which seeks to hold on to that which must be let go. Indeed, all that the ego needs for perpetuation, the memory, conscious, intellect, animal faculties, the functions of the bodily organs are gradually being wrested away, sinking into lethargy, ceasing to function, and the ego becomes confused, terror-stricken, full of panic. There is no escape for the hounded little I. Its doom is upon it. The very material world, which is responsible for its existence, is gradually fading away. He who identifies himself with the ego undergoes a confused and suffering transformation. But he who has glimpsed the greater self takes death calmly. Assured of immortality and the changelessness of spirit, he passes easily from one world to the other. His spirit lays down his body because it is finished with it, and moves into the great expansion where it becomes Lord and Master over all things. Self meets self. The personal becomes the universal, and a new and greater existence in the infinite reduces the just finished life to nothingness, to a second in the endless time of eternity. And so we die as we have lived, with faith or without it, with spiritual knowledge or without it, and according to the wisdom we have attained, we meet death gracefully or crudely, but each of us is immortal nonetheless. So live that when thy summons comes to join the innumerable caravan which moves to that mysterious realm where each shall take his chamber in the silent halls of death. Thou go not like the quarry slave at night, scourged to his dungeon, but sustained and soothed. By an unfaltering trust approach thy grave, like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams. William Cullen Bryant. Review. Number 1. Though body is immortal, a man is never born and never dies. 2. The presence that animates body is invisible even in life, and leaving the body on death is invisible still. 3. Oneself incarnates in all bodies and is deathless, ageless, eternal spirit. 4. Ego shuts us away from the knowledge of self. Ego deludes us into believing it is I. 5. The death of the ego must precede awareness of universal self. 6. Ego is as mortal as the body, and at death we all become universal self. 7. He who banishes ego during his life achieves power, for he moves with God. 8. Neither space nor time exist in the hereafter, nor does form. There is only consciousness, absolute and indivisible. 9. Body is merely used by a mortal spirit as an expression of an idea. It is not self, is but the tiniest expression of self. Number 10. The self enters into each body and becomes different according to what it enters, but upon leaving becomes infinite and absolute and only one. 11. There is no reincarnation for the ego, but constant reincarnation for the self. Number 12. There is only one form of spirit communication, and that is contact between conscious mind and universal subconscious mind. 13. All men are immortal. There is no hell, no punishment. 14. He who perceives self in self will find death an easy transformation. There is an answer to every question, a solution to every mystery, a key for every lock. Throughout this book, we have prepared for the final revelation. Now it is upon us. Recommended reading: Drama of Love and Death by Edward Carpenter, published by Mitchell Kennerly. 11th Meditation. I know that I am pure spirit, deathless, birthless, changeless, and eternal. I am not body. I am not conscious mind. I am not ego. I am sense of self only, consciousness, awareness, unadulterated being. The presence that animates all life is within me, is altogether the real me. I am using my body for a purpose, as an expression of an idea, and when the idea is fully expressed, through my work and my mission, I shall return again to unity with universal self, leaving body and ego behind. I do not confine my body and my ego with what I truly am. My body is simply an instrument for my expression, and my ego is simply memory of physical experience. Returning to infinity and unity, I shall need neither body nor ego. I am free of the domination of the ego. It is not my true self. It is simply an illusion necessary to finiteness and the perception of space and time. I turn away from the ego, withdraw into the depths of my being to the immortal consciousness that lies within. Here in this magic center, my word is law. I need only speak it with faith and conviction, and it will manifest in my life. I am calm and serene, sure and unfaltering, for my roots are in eternity. All the things of life shall change and pass away, but I shall never pass away. For whatever life is, I shall be, one with universal subconscious mind. I need not strive or strain to attain immortality, nor fear punishment, nor aspire for reward. The kingdom of heaven awaits all, the wise, the foolish, the sinner, and the saint, for we are all one in reality, clothed in different forms in this moment of incarnation. I do not fear death, for by it I attain the consciousness of higher self. Neither do I invite death, for it must wait until my work is done. I forsake the ego, perceive self in self, see the majesty, the grandeur, the immortality of the power that dwells within. Chapter 12. The Key. That which from self made each mortal, self unto each mortal must be. Thus the key that unlocks the portal, to God is thyself, thou art he. The veil removed. This is the ineffable secret, the ultimate illumination, the secret to peace and power. You are God. If you will accept this towering truth, dare to stand atop this magnificent pinnacle, universal consciousness will be revealed to you from within. God is there. It is He who peers from behind your eyes, who is your own consciousness, who is your very self. You are not just a part of God. You are altogether God, and God is altogether you. Upanishads. The personal self and the ultimate imperishable impersonal self are one. Vedanta. Not a part, not a mode of that, but identically that absolute spirit of the world. God is universal subconscious mind, the intelligence that pervades all times and places, the design and order and consciousness of all things. God becomes things. He becomes all things. He has become you. God is not your body, not your ego, but your sense of being, your I. There is only one I in the universe. The same sense of self is in everyone. It appears to be different in life because it clothes itself in different forms. These forms wither and decay, but the self is always one and indivisible and changeless. Every person that lives, every person that ever will live, every creature and thing are all one in spirit. All are God, and each is altogether God. Each of us is altogether God because infinite intelligence cannot divide itself. It makes a seeming division in flesh, but never in spirit, for infinity is always one and indivisible. God manifests completely in each thing, and each thing is a manifestation of God's knowledge of himself. Your consciousness is God's consciousness. Your idea of yourself is God's idea of himself. The ideas you accept are automatically manifested in life, for what God knows, he creates, and what you know is created, for you are God. Universal consciousness. God is consciousness and awareness and order and design and knowledge and intelligence and spirit. He is infinite. He cannot know himself as infinity, but only by becoming something finite. Thus God seeks to expand his sense of self by becoming things, and each thing says, I am this. What you believe yourself to be is what you believe God to be. The limitations and lacks you impose upon yourself, you impose upon God. No one can possibly believe there is any limitation on God. Thus, the magnificent truth is that there is no limitation on any man. Through each of us, God attains self-consciousness, and each of us is God incarnate. In our lives, we accept the limitations of the flesh and the inhibitions of the ego, and thus we fall short of God consciousness. We ask ourselves where we have come from and where we are going, for we have lost the remembrance of having always been, just as we cannot see that we will always be. The development of our ego thrusts upon us a precarious duality of mind, wherein conscious mind overruns universal subconscious mind, and we come to regard ourselves as ego only, instead of universal self, which we truly are. How can God possibly be the poor thing that I am? A man will ask himself, identifying himself with ego, failing to perceive that he is consciousness only. Free yourself from the bonds of the ego, and you will forget the poor thing that you thought you were, and become one with God. Illumination. This far you can be guided, but the attainment of enlightenment is yours to achieve alone. Words and logic have never yet provided the great illumination, which must come to each man in his own way. If you will accept with perfect faith the premise that all truth is spiritual, if you will discard the promptings of the ego and the noisy sensual stimuli of the material world, if you will search for revelation at the center of consciousness, then the kingdom of heaven will be yours. Letting go of ego may seem like letting go of life itself, and so it is. Illumination, the arrival at God consciousness, the spiritual perception that you are God will come to you through meditation. As an experience, it is universally the same, but perhaps has never been as well described as by Edward Carpenter. The brain is stilled. It does not cease from its natural and joyful activities, but it ceases from that terrified, joyless quest which was inevitable to it as long as its own existence, its own foundation, its own affiliation to the everlasting being was in question or doubt. The man at last lets thought go. He glides below it into the quiet feeling, the quiet sense of his own identity with the self of other things of the universe. He glides past the feeling into the very identity itself, where a glorious all-consciousness leaves no room for separate self-thoughts or emotions. He leans back in silence on that inner being and bars off for a time every thought, every movement of the mind, every impulse to action, or whatever in the faintest degree may stand between him and that. And so there comes to him a sense of absolute repose, a consciousness of immense and universal power, such as completely transform the world from him. All life is changed. He becomes master of his fate. He perceives that all things are hurrying to perform his will, and whatever in that region of inner life he may condescend to desire, that already is shaping itself to utterance and expression in the outer world about him. In such a manner does a man come to the realization that he himself is God. In such a manner does he learn to turn his attention from the material world and originate all things on the plane of mind. By forsaking ego and finding his true self, whatever he thinks, conceives, or desires will manifest in the physical world. He becomes the doer, the knower, the creator, makes all things from self, is the self of all things. That boundless power, source of every power, manifesting itself as life, entering every heart, living there among the elements, that is self. Upanishads. Find thou but thyself. Though this knowledge is not new, it has been exceedingly rare and held among a very few men. All the ages of life's evolution up through the slime and mist of a fetid and newly formed earth have pointed toward it. There is only one consciousness in all things, one consciousness which assumes countless forms in search of ever greater knowledge about itself. The infinite self becomes the finite self, and the day when finite self recognizes itself as infinite self is the day that exposes eternity. This little hour, this little life where we are focused now, is but an instant in the eons of our being. We are that very power that constructed the heavens and the earth, and when we have cast out ego and the limitations of our thinking, the multi-dimensioned heavens are revealed to be in our souls. We have looked in the mountains, and he has not been there. We have looked on the plain, and he has not been there. We have searched the sea, and the air, and the earth and the sky, and he has not been there. How should we find him when we looked outside? He dwelt within, was in truth our very selves. But what thing dost thou now, looking Godward to cry? I am I, thou art thou. I am low, thou art high. I am thou, who thou seekest to find him. Find thou but thyself, thou art I. Algernon Swinburne. Lock and key. The lock that bars us from the recognition that we are God is the creation of the ego in the first memories and inhibitions of conscious mind. This lock may be undone through meditation, through taking unto ourselves universal consciousness, through arrival at the spiritual kingdom of heaven, and the key that unlooses all power is the revelation that each man is God. Mind is consciousness, is intelligence, and there is only one mind, which is the mind of God. All things are made from it, are ideas manifested into form. As ideas change, so does form, but the spirit never changes. It is limitless, one, and changeless. Universal subconscious mind creates in the physical world those ideas that conscious mind adopts as beliefs. We create evil by false thinking, by ideas of lack and limitation and pain and sorrow and disease. Such evil is illusion because it proceeds from the errors of conscious mind and may be banished by donning the mantle of a mortal self at the center of consciousness. The physical world is but a tiny extension of a vast spiritual realm. All physical law is subordinate to spiritual law, for the physical world is a secondary chain of effects, while the spiritual world is first cause. When man's consciousness expands beyond ego, beyond conscious mind, beyond the limitations of the prompters, thoughts are immediately manifested on the physical plane. Thought transference, clairvoyance, mental healing, and creativeness are all evidences of the superphysical power of universal subconscious mind. A man adds all things unto himself by taking a position with impregnable faith. Faith moves universal subconscious mind to creation, but it is only the ego that must use faith. When the ego goes and God consciousness comes, thought is immediately followed by the thing, for there remains nothing to overcome. All conceptions of limitation and lack and guilt and pain and shame and remorse are cast out with the ego. Nothing but God remains, and whatever God knows is created. We attract into our lives the physical manifestations of the thoughts we think, and in order to attract good instead of evil, we must learn to control our thinking, to think positively instead of negatively. We must be able to choose good thoughts. If a man thinks only in response to the stimuli of the outer world, he remains ego only, an automaton. But when he originates thoughts at the center of consciousness, he creates his own life in the image of his desires and dons the mantle of a mortal self. 12th meditation. I turn away from the world about me to the world of consciousness that lies within. I shut out all memories of the past, create no images of the future. I concentrate on my being, on my awareness. I slide deep into the very recesses of my soul to a place of utter repose. Here I perceive faith in the making, am conscious of the one being from which all beings spring. I know that this immortal self, this is God, this is me. I am, I always was, I always will be. All men, all things, all space and time, and life are here in the depths of my soul. Smaller than small, greater than great, meet and unite in me. That which I thought I was, ego, I never was at all, for it was a changing thing, mirroring the seasons and the tides, a thing to be born and grow and die. I am not a thing of time or circumstance. I am spirit, pure and eternal, birthless, deathless, and changeless. I am patient, for I am all time. I am wise, for I contain the knowledge of all things. I know not pain, for I see there is no beginning and no end, and who suffers pain must see beginning and end. I am rich, for there is no limit to the abundance I may create from my very self. I am successful, for I need only think to achieve. I love and am beloved, for all things are myself, and I am all things. I unite, I fuse, I become one with universal subconscious mind. The mask of vanity and ego I shall never wear again. I perceive the magnificent dweller at the center of my consciousness, and I know him to be my very self. Time and space, shadow and substance, what matter these? I am God.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.